Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being with me this next hour. You are listening to Everyday Astrology with C.A. Brooks on Transcendental Tuesdays. We're broadcasting on 12radio.com and simulcasting on my YouTube channel that has the same name as the show, Everyday Astrology with C.A. Brooks. We have a chat room, a live chat room while we're doing the show over on YouTube, so you're welcome to come on over there. And I see people filing in. Thank you very much for coming. Hey, Leslie, it's good to see you, and Donna. So everybody come over, and one thing I'm going to throw out, and this is kind of not a clear thing, but I've just been, talking to a number of people lately, and I thought, you know what, I'd really like to get your take on what would you like to hear on this show? Or, if you're readers of Mark's Power Peak, what is it you'd like to see in that particular column? If there's some things that would really pique your interest and you go, hey, I'd like you to go more in depth here, or I'd like you to go over there, that's fine. I'd love to hear your comments. So you can go to one2listen.com and subscribe to Mark's Power Peak, and you'll also find my email address, either, I think it's right there in the Power Peak. So you can actually just write me and say, hey, this is what I'd like to see. You can also put it in the chat room here, although I think those chats disappear after the show. So it might be safer if you just wanted to email me and say, hey, I've got an idea. I'd love to see you do this. So I want you to know that I am interested in your comments. And hey, Donna, thank you for joining us today. So let's get started, because we are going to look at the week ahead, which includes a phenomenal number of cosmic and cultural events. So obviously, we're not going to be able to go in depth with many of them. But we're going to touch base. And today alone should clue us in that something big is going on. This morning at 4:01 a.m., that's Pacific time, there was a new moon in the last degree of Aquarius. Now, all those things are phenomenal. A new moon, it's always a brand new cycle, but it was in the very last degree of Aquarius. That's always important too, when you see that kind of transition coming. This was also the first eclipse of 2026, and it was a solar eclipse. That means that from our view on Earth, the moon came in between us and the sun. So temporarily, it obscured our view of the sun. Now, it was visible from Antarctica and some neighboring areas, so I know many of you probably weren't able to see that this morning. But nevertheless, when we look at it from an astrological or a metaphysical point of view, the sun represents our ego. So what happens when our ego gets eclipsed? Well, I think that is a phenomenal kind of message about being willing to look at ourselves and our lives differently, which of course is something I preach. I know that, but I just think it's an important thing. We are not alive if we don't keep adapting and changing. That's what life on this particular planet is all about. So being able to step back, unplug, reboot, whatever you want to call it. And that's what an eclipse seems like to me, is rebooting. So when we're able to kind of step back and say, yeah, maybe I could see myself differently. Maybe I could see myself wearing a different, color. I mean, sometimes there are minor changes that can set off much more important and significant changes in our lives. So the eclipse, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, but there was an eclipse this morning. This is also the Spring Festival, which is also Chinese New Year. And we're celebrating the year of the fire horse, which I just have to laugh when I think about what the fire horse is about, because it is so Aries. It is just so, it's that fire, it's drama, it's, getting out there and doing something. It's energetic. It's a phenomenal energy. And we're not going to go into that on this show. We may look at it in a few weeks, but if that's something that interests you, go ahead and look it up. But for me today, it's all about synchronicity. And Aries, simply because the reason that's catching my eye is because we've got this phenomenal thing of Saturn and Neptune both having just moved into Aries, and they're coming together on Friday. So the fact that this would be the Chinese New Year celebrating a fire horse, it's just, like I said, it's synchronicity, and I'd love to see that. It just kind of tells you that Even when our lives look meaningless, we can find these interesting little meanings because we give it the meaning that it has. All right, so this is also, let's say you don't care about those things, you don't care about the eclipse, you don't care about Chinese New Year. Well, guess what? It's also Fat Tuesday, which is Mardi Gras. So that might be something that you're interested in celebrating, or that, is just really cool for you. And Ramadan begins at sundown tonight. So that's just like an amazing number of things all coalescing today, which is Tuesday, the 17th, if you're listening to this later. Now, of course, it's not random that all these things come together, because many of them, or some of them, are based on the lunar cycle, right? But it's still, in my thinking, I don't remember in years past so many things all coming together exactly on the same day. So this is an exciting day. It's an interesting day. Take your pick of what you want to do, or what you want to look at, or what you want to focus on or celebrate. But that's pretty cool. Then tomorrow, Wednesday, is when the sun enters Pisces. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So once again, not only is that moon at 29 Aquarius, the sun is too. We are going into this transitional period of the sun moving into Pisces. But of course, I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. That means they're coming together. Now, they've been moving in that direction for a long time, for months, really. And it's finally here. It's going to happen on Friday the 20th. And to me, that is one of the most important astrological events, not only of this week, but maybe of this year. And I don't think that's hyperbole. This is a very important thing, and I'll explain why. So that's what we're going to talk about. But meanwhile, remember, you can always check out Mark's Power Peak. You can find it at 12house.com, or find links on 12listen.com. Almost any of the 12 sites, you're going to find a link to Mark's Power Peak. And that, it's an online newsletter, basically. You can subscribe to it for free. And when you do, you get it in your email box every Saturday night. And what I do is I write a column for the week ahead, which basically tells you on every single day what the astrological energy is. And of course, because I do a number of other things, including I Ching and Tarot and numerology, and, and build in some spirituality and that kind of stuff, and maybe even some feng shui, then, sometimes you may read those days and go, okay, now where did she get that from a moon in Aquarius? Well, it's because it's really a combination. And some of it is just pure intuition, in terms of I see something, or I hear it, and I just know what that means, and I think it needs to go in the column for that day. So if that's a good way to kind of go back and say, well, she didn't talk about that on the show too much, but I want to go back and see what's going on. That's a good resource for you. Plus, there are a number of other articles in the Power Peak, which includes things on tarot and spirituality and feng shui and numerology. So, go check those things out, because, whatever kind of trips your trigger, these are just all a number of tools or lenses or ways to view life. And that's what I think is important. Once again, we give life the meaning that it has for us. And that depends on the lenses that we're using to view it. And guess what? We get to choose those lenses. And by the way, that's what you're going to hear a lot about today: personal responsibility. Because I think that's what Saturn and Neptune is all about, coming together. But let's start looking at this week with the new moon solar eclipse. So we did kind of, get into what it really means, and it is important. In any other week, that's what we'd be talking about. We'd spend all our time looking at that new moon eclipse, and see, new moons or full moons that also are eclipses, they have an extra punch, a lot more information coming in. So the other thing to remember, and maybe this is just true of life in general, but astrology in general, this week is full of symbols that have to do with endings and releases and new beginnings. Because once again, the new moon is the closing of a chapter, so that a new one will open up. The solar eclipse is the same kind of thing. It shuts down the light. I see the solar eclipses, if we were a computer or, some kind of digital device, it would be the same thing as unplugging it, shutting it down, rebooting it. I think that's what the eclipse does, especially a solar one, because once again, it's ego. The sun is eclipsed. It's our ego, our self-perception, our sense of who we are as individuals. Now, I know on one hand you can say, well, that could be pretty disorienting. And, sometimes it is. We do get into situations, and not necessarily just on the eclipses, but we get into situations where maybe we see how somebody else sees us, or just in general, our idea about who we are gets really challenged. That's okay. It truly is. Like I said, it's a growth process. And so, if we invite it in and say, yeah, I just want to see myself in a different light, maybe you want to move in a new direction and you're just not quite sure how to do it. Well, start by just observing what's going on. Maybe there is a way, maybe there's something you haven't thought about yet. So this is Tuesday, the last day the sun is in Aquarius, as it heads for Pisces tomorrow. It's also that day where the eclipse is resetting lots of things about our ego. And here again, the sun moving into Pisces. So this has to do with identity for all of us. So this week is full of those releases, the endings, and the new beginnings, with the sun moving into Pisces. But the other thing, and we'll kind of move into that sun in Pisces talk, I think in this particular situation, maybe not always, but in this particular situation, I think the Pisces 30-day cycle is going to be like a bridge that we are walking across, a transition that we are making psychologically or spiritually or emotionally from the old astrological year to the next, because Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. So in some ways, everything seems to dissolve into Pisces before the sun is reborn in the new astrological year when it moves into Aries, which will happen on March 20th. So that's another thing. It's like that bridge analogy kept coming to me this week for a number of reasons, but that's one of them, because we're bridging an old year with a new one as we go through Pisces. And so, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you look at the charts, and literally, like, let's pretend all these events have their own birth chart, which they do. So the new moon eclipse and the sun's entry into Pisces, when you look at those charts, one of the things that predominates is that they're heavily influenced by that dynamic conjunction between Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which is perfect on Friday. Now, as I keep saying, it's perfect on Friday. These are slow-moving planets. And once again, that's more metaphorical than anything else. Saturn and Neptune are pretty far out from the sun. So from our perspective, when we look at them from day to day, they don't look like they've moved very far, because they're so far away from us and they're so far away from the sun. So when I speak in astrology and I say, hey, those are really slow moving planets, or that's a little planet or a big planet, I'm not usually referring to the actual physics of it. I'm talking about what it looks like to us from planet Earth. Because once again, you know what astrology is? Thousands of years of observations of what things look like humans. And as they look at the cosmos, we've developed all of these belief systems about astrology and about mythology and gods and, whatever it is. We've developed all of those through observation. So everything is from our perspective here on Earth. So, we're going to get into a little bit more of the Pisces, I think, that energy. But first, before we leave, technically, I want to go through the new moon solar eclipse and then the sun in Pisces, and then we'll get to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So here are some of my thoughts. If we were just, and I want to say in isolation, but we can't look at the new moon solar eclipse in isolation. But if we were just looking at this, and what does this really mean? And looking there again at the chart, well, the sun and the moon are also square Uranus. Uranus is sitting at 27 Taurus. So with the sun and the moon together today, they're square Uranus. And why is that important? Well, it's always important if there's another planet involved, and it's making especially, an obvious angle. And a square always says there needs to be a choice. An adjustment has to be made because there's a conflict, there's a challenge. And Uranus is important because it's the ruler of Aquarius. So, see, that may be even more dominant or more important, saying, you know what? Something's got to give here. And Uranus is the planet that helps us move through conflict or move through limitations and things that feel too tight, things that feel like that we've outlived them. So when we are in our lives and we just feel like, hey, I need a new habit, or this just isn't working for me, usually that's a Uranian kind of thing. This coat doesn't fit anymore, these boots don't fit anymore, or just this lifestyle doesn't fit. So the very fact that the sun and the moon are in Aquarius, which itself is very much about moving forward, about the future, about being progressive, and it's squaring the ruler of Aquarius, Uranus. That to me underscores the importance of looking at something and being willing to make a change. And remember, those squares, they do present challenges, but what they're saying is you got a choice. Go one way or the other, or maybe you find a compromise, but an adjustment needs to be made, or you're going to continue to feel this particular conflict. So, that Taurus is a slow moving, kind of conservative and patient sign. I mean, literally, Taurus takes its time. It's determined. It has a plan and it's going to follow it. So that square also underscores looking at habits and traditions, or what I would almost call simply lazy conveniences. Things that we've slipped into because they're easy, they're convenient. And sometimes do you ever feel like you're going through your life like you're somewhat drugged? You're in a drugged sleep and you hit the button on the coffee pot or whatever it is. Well, Taurus can get into that. Taurus can get into that habitual behavior. So Uranus and Taurus square that new moon is just going, wake up. And that's, I think, one of the strong messages this week. Wake up. The day is dawning. The sun is rising with that eclipse. The sun literally comes out of that shadow and says, wake up, I'm here. And of course, the sun, I think, can symbolize a lot of things to us, but it's no doubt it's life. We wouldn't have life on planet Earth without our particular sun. That just wouldn't happen. But that sun is also symbolic, therefore, of our connection to a divine source. So whether you want to look at this very literally and say, hey, wake up, it's time to change some habits, or if you want to say, hey, this is like a spiritual awakening, or it's waking up something within me about, some personal change or some spiritual or intuitive connection that I want to have, think about it that way. This new moon is about waking up. The sun is coming out. The sun is rising. It's coming back to life for us. Maybe there's something in our lives that is coming back to life. So if we're feeling like we're not really acting according to clarity or acting with purpose, well, the sun is waking us up. The darkness is leaving, and check it out, because something about the actual light, the sun coming out from that shadow, is also our inner light. And being able to appreciate the power that we have within us to recognize our inner light and joy. The sun often is a symbol of just pure joy, just enjoying something, just being in that moment of happiness or contentment. So another thing that it may not seem immediately obvious, remember Saturn, the disciplinarian, the planet of responsibility, is the traditional ruler of Aquarius. Now, we're not going to go into all that today, but some of the signs have traditional rulers as well as what we call modern rulers. And Saturn, before we knew about Uranus out there, Saturn was the ruler of both Capricorn and Aquarius. And oftentimes you still feel or sense that tie of Saturn to Aquarius. So, if you say, hey, yeah, I put those two things together, that's one of the reasons you do. So I think together, Saturn and Uranus in this new moon are saying, wake up, smell the coffee, drink the coffee if you want, but wake up and take authority in your life. Be responsible. See yourself through your own eyes. Okay, now let's move into the sun in Pisces. And happy birthday to all of you out there who are Pisces babies. I'm one. I have my sun in Pisces, although that's the only thing I have in Pisces. And so when you hear me sound a lot more like a Sagittarian or an Aries, that's why, because I've got most of my planets in fire and air signs, but I am a Pisces. Now, because Venus and Mercury already moved into Pisces, we discussed this sign in the last few weeks. I know we've put some time into that. So I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to talk about that today. But, you might want to go back and check out some of those shows where we talked about Pisces, but I'll touch base on some of the more important things. This is a sign that's ruled by Neptune. So once again, see the synchronicity here. Neptune, which is an important planet right now because of the conjunction to Saturn, well, it's also the ruler of Pisces. And there again, it is actually what we call a modern ruler. Jupiter was the original ruler of Pisces. But this is the planet that's getting a lot of attention because it just moved into Aries, and it's going to be there for 13 years. So there again, if you're a Pisces, but even if you're not, I want you to think about that. Pisces has certain qualities that go along with Neptune, but Neptune itself, it just moved into a fire sign, a very initiating, a very forward, forward thinking. That's more Aquarian, but that Aries energy is very courageous. It is willing to take a risk. It's very different than Pisces. But we know that with Neptune in Aries, that flavor is going to be in this particular cycle with the sun in Pisces. But ordinarily, if you're just taking Pisces in her purity, and very based on Neptune, it's extremely sensitive. Now, when I say sensitive, in many ways it truly is. Like, for instance, sometimes Pisces will be very, very, not allergic, so to speak, but just sensitive to certain drugs. Like one person could take, a whole aspirin or something, and they can only take a half. They tend to respond quickly, very receptive to medications, to alcohol, to any kind of environmental element. They're receptive. And there again, think of some of these words in different contexts. Not only receptive to their actual environment, because in fact they kind of absorb like a sponge. They become like their environment. But that's also a sense of their intuitive abilities. They're very intuitive. They tend to have, psychic abilities, which, by the way, I think everybody does. But I think when there's Pisces or Neptune heavily in your chart, you tend to recognize it a little bit earlier. Those are the kids that, are off doing very, very creative things, or, having the playmates that aren't there, or talking to animals, etc. Sometimes they're just more willing to do it because it's like, well, isn't that what everybody does? Right? So, and remember too, you have Pisces somewhere in your chart. It's always there. But this is the part of you with Neptune that says, we are all one. We're all in this ocean. And we may have different forms, but we're all together. They don't see the separation like some people do. And when I think of Pisces, I put them in a category of mermaids, or mystics, or both, but that's what they're like. And they're gentle spirits, that are very receptive and responsive, and like I said, sensitive, and, in that ocean. And they come out of the ocean every once in a while, and they're trying to live in the world. But, that Pisces, when they just get overloaded, overwhelmed, what do? They go back to that inner world that is within them. But that mystic is the same kind of thing. These people tend to be very spiritual. And here again, I'm not saying religious, even though they may be religious as well. They're spiritual, they're mystical, they're metaphysical. And very much like their opposite sign, Virgo, they do need those regular times when they can pull away, be quiet, rest, reflect. They need to hear themselves think. Because maybe more so than the other signs, they are very connected to an inner voice or to a sense of belonging to a bigger group. And so when they become disoriented, it's when they can't hear their own voice, which is true of all of us. They can't quite connect to that. But a lot of Pisces, like some of the words that we associate with them are kindness, empathy, compassion. And as I said, they're the last sign of the zodiac. And in that sense, they are natural chameleons. They seem to truly understand and can mimic the other signs more so than the others. I mean, literally, kind of the consummate actors, where they can just take on the personalities and the characteristics of other signs because they seem to just understand them. And like I said, they can just take on the color, the feelings, the look of their environments. You know how just like certain liquids can literally absorb whatever is in the air, or if they're exposed to something, they become like that, they smell like that, they taste like that. That's what Pisces is. And yet, one thing I want to caution you on is don't see Pisces, or if you are a Pisces, as, oh my God, I'm so delicate, I just can't be exposed to anything, and poor me. Do not do that. You are not a victim, but recognize that you tend to take on that, the milieu that you're in. And so if you're one of those people that you easily get overwhelmed, or you go, oh, I just can't take this anymore, just know what your limits are. Just know what you can do. Like, for instance, that's true of anybody. If, you want to go out for a walk and you go, hey, I'm very comfortable with an hour walk or a mile walk, then don't go for 25 miles because somebody else suggests it. Know what your limits are. Know what your characteristics are, but also know that you're very malleable. You can become like those other signs. And there again, some of the things we see with Pisces in terms of hobbies or professions: psychology, therapy, nutrition. They love alternative and complementary medicine usually. We often find people with Pisces are artists and musicians. Almost anything that involves imagination and creativity is very Piscean. And a few people, I'll just mention them, I don't have quotes today, but a few people that seem, very characteristic of this is Michelangelo. Renoir, the painter, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, George Harrison, Chopin, Dr. Seuss. Now, we all know at least a line from Dr. Seuss, right? And many, like I said, many actors, like Elizabeth Taylor, just being able to take on various personalities and various roles. So, while the sun is in Pisces, remember it influences all of us. Find some time for yourself. And I mean that. That's one of the messages of Pisces, is if you really want to be yourself and you want to, kind of control that sensitivity and use it for good, then make sure you have time for yourself and that you're not just giving it all away. Because truly, Pisces is also, a couple of the words that we also associate with them are martyrs and sacrifice, because they're always going to see what somebody else needs. And oftentimes, and I can tell you from this from experience, sometimes when I'm with another person, I literally feel like I know less about what I want or need, but I know what they want or need. And it just feels like, oh, well, that's what I want and need. And then I get away from them, or I'm not in their presence, and it's like, oh, that's not what I want. And it's hard to explain why that is, but we just kind of merge or meld with the psychology or with the thinking or the mind of that other person. So find some time for yourself and just make sure not that you're using defenses, but that you're using appropriate boundaries. And remember, it's the last sign of the zodiac. So we are literally transitioning from the old astrological year to the new one. And we might be feeling sentimental or moody, I mean, think about it, think about New Year's Eve, or think about that whole thing. The year's wrapping up, and sometimes don't we get that way? We're sentimental, or even maybe sad, or maybe we're thinking about the things that we regret or some losses. So if you feel yourself being deeply emotional, very feeling and into that, that's part of walking across that transitional bridge from the old year to the new one. And there again, you don't have to be a Pisces to feel that. And when I kind of just looked at the Pisces energy this year, I felt like, even maybe like that very strong Aries energy, maybe we are regretting it. It's like, I don't want to let go of the Pisces thing, So it feels to me like a number of people might be having some, I would just say, sadness or some being sentimental and moody during the next, 3 to 4 weeks while the sun is in Pisces, because, maybe we're just looking at, what you consider the past. And if you have never seen Midnight in Paris, that movie, I think, is phenomenal. I mean, I just absolutely love it. But one of the overwhelming messages of that, and by the way, it's a Woody Allen movie. It was got a lot of Academy Award nominations in 2011, I think. But part of the idea is how we're sentimental and always wanting the past because we think it's so much better than where we are now. But it's Woody Allen, so he does it in a very charming and funny way. And I just happened upon that movie a few days ago, and I thought, oh my God, what perfect timing. Because that's almost what it is, that sentimentality, and yet recognizing that every single time period has its purpose. And, one isn't necessarily better than another. So if you're so inclined, watching movies is a perfect thing to do with the sun in Pisces, truly, because they rule photography and illusions and movies. So go check that out if you've never seen it. And even if you have seen it, go watch it again. Wonderful music, wonderful photography in Paris. And it's just, you'll get the Pisces thing if you watch that movie. But here's the other thing. So let's say that we are kind of feeling sentimental or we're feeling kind of moody or whatever. I think this period is about what came to me as the line, uncorking the genie. And what I mean by that is just really feeling your inner voice, seeing yourself as the magician, dreaming the life that you want. So are you willing to uncork the genie? Or are you going to just keep her in the bottle? And she's sitting in there doing whatever she wants. She's got this rich inner world, but she's not coming out and doing anything with it. So remember, and that's an important idea too with Neptune and Saturn together, which we will explore over the next few weeks. But think of this period as uncorking the genie. Seeing or finding or connecting with that magician, that dreamer inside yourself and giving it value. And if you tend to be overwhelmed, remember, prioritize yourself, prioritize your health, your mental health, and your happiness. And sometimes that happiness, joy, or contentment is simple. It's just saying, like, you're in the middle of meetings, or you're in the middle of all these things you have to do on your to-do list. Well, can you take 2 minutes and have a cup of tea? Can you take 2 minutes and just stop and say, hey, I'm going to walk outside, and whether it's in a snowstorm or it's sunshine, I'm just going to walk outside. I'm just going to experience something else. I'm just taking a short little break because the Piscean mermaid mystic needs to kind of reconnect. So just know that about yourself and do it. Don't give all of your energy to everybody else or to make sure everybody else's needs are taken care of and just lose sight of what you really need in your life. Okay? All right. So now we are going to move on to Saturn conjunct Neptune. And here again, this is a big deal. So we will be talking about it. In fact, quite truthfully, astrologers have been talking about it for at least a year. I mean, that's how it works. When we see something coming up, we're going, woo, that's pretty cool. Now, another thing I want you to know is this is something that happens on average every 36 years. Saturn and Neptune come together about every 36 years. So if you want to think about it, it's almost like having a baby. They're giving birth to a brand new energy. But and I bring that up too, because every once in a while, something's going on in the cosmos, and, maybe Saturn and Neptune are in opposition, or maybe they're in a square. You know what you'll hear somebody do? They'll refer back to the moment when Saturn was conjunct Neptune, because they're looking at that cycle and saying, what was that cycle about? And now we're 15 years away from it, or maybe we're 7 years away from it, or how many ever years. Many astrologers will refer back to the conjunction. And that's one of the reasons I want to kind of emphasize that. We're now like at that moment of the conjunction. And the last time there was a conjunction was 1989. The one before that, I think, was like in 53. So there again, if you were born in and around 53, late 52 in there, you might have Saturn and Neptune conjunct in your chart. If you were born around 89, you probably have Saturn and Neptune conjunct in your particular chart. So it'd be something kind of worth looking at if you've never looked at it before. So some of the things I'm saying today may apply to you, that it's like literally hardwired right there into your chart. But we're coming up, we're coming up to the moment. And also I want to emphasize the fact that we keep saying it's perfect on Friday, but it's been going on for months and months. It's because, like, for instance, if you look at a chart today or a chart a week or so ago, you're going to see both Saturn and Neptune at 0. But remember, in astrology, it's not just that particular number. It's kind of like a clock. So it's not 5 o'clock, it's 5:16, or it's 9:10. So that's when we say it's perfect. They're both at 0, but the minute comes down to perfection on Friday. So, for all intents and purposes, they're conjunct right now. But astrologically speaking, it's not perfect. And if I ask you to meet me at 5:15 and you show up at 5:05, I might not be there, right? Now, I'm very close, but I'm not there. That's why, when we really insist on it being conjunct on a particular day, that's why. But here's some ideas, and throughout I'm going to throw some of these things out in the next 15, 20 minutes. I think this is a time, it's a time certainly for taking responsibility, because we're talking about Saturn. We're talking about Aries, first sign of the zodiac. Aries says independence. I'm going to do it. I'm going to take a risk. I'm not going to sit back and wait for an invitation. But it's about liberating ourselves from existing limitations on our thinking and our consciousness about what is possible. And here again, think of it like, if you're trying to, figure out what does this look like, it's very similar to when we talk about the new moon. We're talking about two planets joining together and at an exact astrological degree. So from our perspective on Earth, if we look out, it looks like they are just sitting in the same space or sitting right next door to each other. So we make a big deal of those new moons, right? Well, this is kind of like a new moon, only it's Saturn and Neptune that are doing it. They're coming together. And there again, the sun and the moon come together every 29 and a half days. And we make a big deal of it. It's a new moon. This one only comes together every 36 years. So, of course, we pay a lot of attention to it, because it is a new astrological birth chart. And, when you look at that particular thing too, in some cases, like if you start looking it up, what you'll find, like for instance, in 1989, well, it actually came together on March 3rd, June 24th, and November 13th. So of course you're going, hey, wait a minute, CA, if it's only going to, happen, if it has to be that perfect, why are there 3 dates? Retrogrades, that's what happens most of the time, or it's not out of the ordinary, let's put it that way, that because of that retrograde motion, we'll see those two planets dancing back and forth together over maybe even a 2-year period. So oftentimes there are 3 exact conjunctions. And that's what happened in 1989. They were both in Capricorn. But because of their retrograde patterns, they were perfect on March 3rd. They came together again on June 24th and again on November 13th. So that's why there's 3. But this time, even though Saturn and Neptune came pretty close together in Pisces last year, they weren't exact. They weren't perfect. So now in Aries, they come together perfectly only one time. And that's going to be this Friday, February 20th. Now, the truth is, though, they're going to stay in an influential range of each other. And what that means is within 7 degrees. They're going to stay within 7 degrees until about the middle of May. And that's when Saturn, which is the faster moving of the two planets, it's going to outpace Neptune. But then Saturn's going to go into an annual retrograde, and it will bring Saturn back within that 7-degree framework mid-October through January 12th of 2027. So in some ways, even though we're making all this big to-do about it's this Friday, and it is, they're going to stay within range off and on this year and through January 12th. Now, once we hit January 12th, that's when Saturn will finally really outdistance and just move away from Neptune. But see, this is a very rich kind of period when this is going on between the two of them. And here again, I see it as infinite potential. But I also want you to know that blending Saturn and Neptune is what I call no walk in the park. And here again, I use a lot of reference books in my work. I go back and I look at what other astrologers and people have said about Saturn and Neptune. But unfortunately, especially some of the older ones, I'd say, they're so into kind of locked in definitions. And they don't like to put Saturn and Neptune together. And, you can imagine why. Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn and traditional ruler of Aquarius. It's a planet of order, structure, discipline. It's the ultimate symbol of the material world. It's how we take authority. It's the boss. It's the government. It's those big organizations. It's the CEO. Now, what is Neptune? Neptune, if you're thinking of Saturn as hard edges, Neptune is totally soft edges, no edges. It represents spirituality, imagination, transcending the physical world. Now think about that. For everything that Saturn builds up, Saturn is a builder, a methodical step-by-step building, an architect. Neptune transcends the physical world. So in other words, Saturn builds something up and Neptune comes along and just says, what world? What structure? It transcends it. Neptune is that planet that reminds us that we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. So yeah, it can be difficult to figure out, well, what happens when Saturn and Neptune get together? Aren't they just fighting all the time? Aren't they just kind of, getting rid of what the other one is doing? But no, these are some of the analogies that I would give to you. And yet, like I said, it's not that I don't think that doesn't happen. It can, but we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, right? We're doing that all the time, every moment of our perceived lives. So think of it this way, though. Saturn is the container that holds the water of Neptune. I mean, literally, Saturn can be the container, Neptune is the water. But Saturn is also things like the coastline. Think of the ocean or a riverbed. Saturn is the physical, the sand, the dirt, the plants growing along the coastline that define the edge of the ocean, that define Neptune. Neptune is all the water, but Saturn is defining, limiting the edges. However, think about it. What does that ocean do? It often defies the coastline and defines the coastline itself because of the perpetual motion. Oceans break down all those landscapes. Oceans, tsunamis, or just even the gentle wave action day after day after day. Water breaks down rock. So rock may be a container for water, but the water will eventually, over time, break down the structure. And even a lazy river, think how often, like if you see pictures or maps over time of how a river has completely changed its course. That is the effect of Neptunian water changing the structure of Saturn. So one thing that I think, and I'm just trying to hold this in my mind, is when these two planets connect, we feel a desire and a need to create a bridge between our inner and our outer worlds. Because once again, they exist. And it's not about one over the other. It's about finding a way for them to work together to create and to enjoy the structures that we have in our lives. So we have an investment in finding ways to integrate what I consider like our dreams, our spiritual values, with the way we organize and structure our physical material lives. And truly, when we have conflict between those two things, or just even it's disconnected, it feels familiar because we're used to it, but it's not comfortable. It's not satisfying. When those two things are not in alignment, we just feel unfulfilled. And remember, Aries is all about action. So, and movement and taking a risk. So, I'm not going to say one planet prefers that sign over another. I don't think that's necessarily true. In fact, Saturn, which tends to be cautious and methodical and step by step, but I want to have a plan, it's going to have to adapt to Aries, because Aries is impulsive and says, let's just do it. Let's just try it. Let's see what happens. But we're going to have to allow our imaginations, our creativity, the spiritual foundations represented by Neptune to guide our choices and actions. And then we will feel more rewarded. But here again, it's going to be a back and forth process. Now, I think one thing that's kind of lucky maybe or fortuitous, Saturn has just spent 2.5 years in Pisces. So there, we've learned some things. And so that's one thing I tell you too is, what have you learned in the last 2.5 years? What has come to you? Has your spiritual practice changed? Has your attitude, your personal philosophy, your creativity, if you've gotten into something that you really love, or maybe you found out I don't like it at all, don't lose sight of those lessons, because they're important experiences. They're important in terms of the insight they have given to us. And they might help us with Saturn in Aries, because as it comes together with Neptune, we'll kind of understand that. And this Aries, it is a sign of action and courage and movement. So, and here again, we're going to be talking more and more over the next month, for months. And like I said, really for 36 years about what that energy looks like. I call it offspring. What is their offspring going to look like? And one thing you might consider, and I'm not saying something's happening Friday, don't hear that, but it is interesting that the last time that Saturn and Neptune were together, it was in Capricorn. So remember, physicality, the world, CEOs, management, organization. In November of 1989, the last of those 3 times it came together was literally within days of when the Berlin Wall came down. That was a wall that had been standing since 1961, dividing East from West Berlin. But more importantly than that, it represented a significant philosophical and political world division. And it literally came down within days in November of Saturn and Neptune coming together. So as we look at Aries, and this is where we don't have time to get into all of it, so I'm just going to throw out some ideas. I think we will prioritize individuality. And here again, that's a word that I think is important with these two planets and with Aries. Prioritize. This is about Saturn saying, I want to take control. So what are we going to take control of? We're going to prioritize our individuality. I think we are going to prioritize, or we are going to look a lot more seriously about responsibility, personal responsibility, so that we can fully participate in our lives and not feel like somebody else is calling all the shots, but also just taking responsibility for making sure that we're inspired and how we're using our talents and how we're how we're working with other people as well. Because here's another piece we haven't mentioned, but Pluto's in Aquarius right now. That's a progressive sign of brotherhood, friendship, working together collectively towards creating a new world view. So see, Pluto is going to have a lot to say, because Pluto is going to work very collaboratively with Saturn and Neptune in Aries. That's fire and air. They work together well. And obviously, we've got a lot of time to think about this energy, to absorb it, and just see what comes to you. But what I wanted to throw out before we end the show today is, and we'll continue this maybe next week. We'll see. Because, I feel like what got short shrift is we didn't talk a lot about Saturn and Aries in general, because that was the week Mo was on the show. And I want to go back with some information there. We'll probably do that next week. But think about the words that have to do with Neptune. They dissolve, transcend. It's creative, spiritual, it's imagination. It's the dreamer, psychic, intuition. Who's Saturn? Saturn's a manifester, the disciplinarian, responsibility, self-confidence, structures, rules and guidelines, consolidation, maturity, patience. So I'm throwing out those words because I want you to play with the idea of putting them together. So like one way of putting them together is saying these two as a couple, you know how they put names together? Well, they're creative discipline. They're practical dreamers. It's psychic authority, responsible manifestation, idealistic architect. I just think there's ways that we can play with these characteristics in these words and come up with your own little tagline. Like I can't think of one, J-Lo or whatever, how they put two different people's names together. Well, put Saturn and Neptune together in terms of their characteristics. So during this time, and this is what I'll leave you with today, is just think about how can you put those ideas together? Is there one of those that just grabs you and say, yeah, I'm just going to see this as a time of creative discipline, or being idealistically responsible, but prioritize. And we're going to prioritize a number of things in our lives because Aries says, it's me. I want to do it. I'm off. I'm not waiting for anybody else. They can follow me. Prioritize spiritual practices and prioritize your personal development. And I want you to know these aren't just words. I want you to really think about how do you put it into practice? What is it that trips your trigger? How do you consciously schedule your life, structure your life for spirituality, for personal development? It kind of goes back to like simple things like I love to watercolor. But if I don't have a place to do it, if I don't set aside time to do it, do you think it's going to happen? No, it's not going to happen. So we're going to have to create structures and channel creativity. We're going to have to channel our spirituality or leave a space for different things to happen in our lives that Neptune helps us connect with. But Saturn's going to help us structure it and figure out how we're going to put it into our lives. Saturn's going to help us be more responsible for how that is going to happen. So there again, there's a lot more to talk about here. But the first thing is be the neutral observer. Don't blame yourself if you feel like you're not where you're going to be, because of course you're not where you're going to be. You're going to continue to move and change and evolve over time. We all are. This is going to be a phenomenal energy. You don't miss it if you don't do anything on Friday. Just recognize that that's the day that it's really coming together. But it will, like I said, over months this year, it's still going to be in the cosmos. It's still going to be there. Okay? All right. We'll talk more about it next week and, like I said, in months to come. But heads up, Mercury's moving retrograde next Wednesday, February 25th. And truthfully, as I look forward, I don't see a whole lot going on next week. So maybe that really will be a period when we can just kind of acclimate and sit with some of this energy. But Mercury is moving retrograde in Pisces, which will be wonderful because it'll give us an opportunity to kind of, check out, check in, do that, once again, that reboot, just spend some time looking at ourselves and looking at our inner path and journey. All right, so we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for listening. And I want to thank Serena for being our producer today. Stay tuned because up next is Empowerment with Kelly Whetstone. You can find her on YouTube and on 12radio.com. Now, I am going to leave you with a quote. This is from President John F. Kennedy. He did have his Saturn conjunct his Neptune. However, it was out of sign, meaning Saturn was actually at the very end of Cancer, and Neptune was at the very beginning of Leo. But I saw this quote and I thought it's perfect when you think about how these things happen, how these energies come together. And in this case, he's talking about peace, but you could substitute another word. He says peace is a daily, a weekly, a monthly process, gradually changing opinions, slowly eroding old barriers, quietly building new structures. And however undramatic the pursuit of peace, that pursuit must go on. So that's a quote. I'm signing out. You can find me for personal sessions on one2listen.com. Please feel free to request a scheduled call at a time that's good for you. You've been listening to Everyday Astrology, where we're streaming on 12radio.com and on YouTube, where we are changing the way you listen to the world.